Thank you very much for joining us tonight, late, but better late than never, to our next session in our series on international law. The topic of the session is enforced disappearances as a form of torture under international law. I'm the Executive Director of Minerva Center, the Jewish Voice for Human Rights. We work to protect and promote human rights, drawing on Jewish values and Jewish experience. We work in the UK to make the case for human rights as a response to the Holocaust and as a Jewish legacy, and to reinvigorate the language of human rights, both within the Jewish community and within the wider public sphere. We do this through a combination of advocacy and lobbying work, and empowering tomorrow's human rights advocates with knowledge and skills. Well, we're a UK-based campaigning organization, and we only lobby for policy change in the UK. As a Jewish human rights organization that builds on the narrative that the modern human rights framework was developed in response to the Holocaust and predominantly shaped initially by Jewish human rights lawyers like our namesake, Monsieur René Cassin, we've been mindful of our role since October 7th, 2023, to help our supporters understand the complex international legal framework that applies to the events of October 7th and those since. As I'm guessing most of us know, on October 7th, 2023, over 5,000 Hamas terrorists invaded Israel and committed horrific atrocities against Israeli and foreign women, men, and children. Alongside acts of torture and sexual abuse, close to 1,200 Israelis were murdered and 255 were kidnapped to Gaza. Since then, 49 hostages were rescued by the IDF, 8 of them alive, 41 dead. 138 were released alive in 2023 and more recently in January and February 2025, and 9 bodies were returned. 59 hostages remain in Gaza, of which 24 are estimated to be alive. Today is day 542 of their captivity. We know from testimonies provided by those who were released about the nature of their captivity, including starvation, torture, and sexual abuse. Many of them were held in tunnels and alone, with no access to the Red Cross or any known form of foreign support. On the 16th of December 2024, the International Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists and the Hostages and Missing Families Forum in Israel submitted a formal response to the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture on the critical issue of hostage-taking and torture. The submission established that the torture and inhumane treatment inflicted by Hamas extends beyond the hostages and includes also their families, particularly children waiting for fathers still held in captivity. I'm delighted to have join us this evening one of the key contributors to that report, Dr. Ido Rosenzweig. Ido is the Director of Research in Terrorism, Belligerencies, and Cyber, and a research fellow at the Minerva Center for the Study of Law Under Extreme Conditions, that's a mouthful, at the University of Haifa. He is co-founder and chairperson of ALMA, the Association for the Promotion of International Humanitarian Law, and is an international lawyer with practical and academic experiences in international humanitarian and human rights law. I first came across Ido after October 7th, having read many of his articles published in the Times of Israel, where he provided excellent analysis of the implications of international law since October 7th. And I'm delighted that Ido will now speak probably for around half an hour, after which we'll open it up for conversation and questions for the audience. As you've noticed, this event is recorded, and I will ask that while Ido is speaking, if you could please just make sure that you remain muted. So Ido, without any further delay, we've had enough delays, and my apologies again. The mic is yours.
Thank you very much, Mia, for the invitation. Thank you for Minerva Center for the invitation. as Mia said, I'm working at the University of Haifa. I'm working chairing ALMA Association, but in the last 18 months, pretty much, my main passion and the most important thing I'm affiliated with is the Forum of the Hostages and Missing Persons Forum, the Forum of the Families, Hostages and Missing Families, where we established an international law department within that forum pretty much on October 15 of 2023, and with the understanding that we are going to do everything that we can to help the families to do whatever they need to do, however they think it should be done in order to bring their loved ones back. And ever since then, we've been working sometimes in high capacity, sometimes in low capacity, depends which one of our team, under the amazing leadership of Dr. Shali Aviv-Yaini, who is there, I think, 24/7 at the forum, staying there. And it was kind of her idea to get in touch with the Special Rapporteur, Alice Edwards. And from that point on, she asked me to help with that because my work, until a couple of years ago, I've been affiliated for 4 or 5 years with the International Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists. And therefore, my knowledge of the UN arena, and especially the Geneva area, is very, very useful to the work of the families, for the work of the forum, vis-a-vis the UN and its experts. And what we found out is that we need to make sure that these arenas in international law can be utilized in the best way for the families. But we also understand, and I think we've said that from day one, international law will not bring anyone back home. This is not a tool that is able to bring people. It is a tool of language. And it does allow us to speak with the international community. It allows us to lobby with the international community, and it allows us to make sure that the international community is still aware of the hostages. And if you just think about the process we've been through with other conflicts, it is very easy to be very alert in the first couple of months. And we see the international community very alert in the first couple of months, but then they move on to the next problem. And we know that there are a lot of problems in today's world. So our role was to use international law to make sure that the issue of the hostages and the condition of the hostages and the status of the hostages remains within public opinion and international community mindset. And for that purpose, we've been active in the international arena, including the Human Rights Council, the General Assembly, the Security Council, International Criminal Court, etc. Within that framework of the Human Rights Council and human rights in Geneva in general, we've been in touch with the Special Rapporteur on torture, Dr. Alice Edwards, who's been very professional and very forthgoing in her approach towards the notion of the hostages. And she was very concerned about the situation. And she was also vocal about that, which was very important. And that has led to a process wherein she thought that the notion of hostages and torture was important, but underdeveloped. And therefore, she published a call for submission for information about international law in the aspect of hostage taking and torture. And we kind of jumped on that and said, well, we don't think just hostage taking and torture are linked. Definitely they are linked, and I'm going to talk about that. But we care also about the families of the hostages And the families of the hostages are, in many cases, are neglected in the discussion about torture, because it might seem to be that they are not direct victims of the torture. The hostages might be direct victims, but their families are not direct victims. So we sat down and thought, how can we work with that, and what can we do? And together, in a joint collaboration of the Hostages and Missing Families Forum, Dr. Shelley Aviv and myself on that side, and the International Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists, my old hat, with their CEO, Advocate Hila Kugler-Ramot, and Advocate Sharon Banyan. We worked together and wrote that report. And well, for me, of course, it was a great collaboration, because it's always fun to work with your previous workplace and make sure that you're able to use your past experience in order to contribute to the most important cause that I'm probably ever been involved with. And our goal, as I said, was to demonstrate that Hamas treatment towards the families of the hostages constitute torture, cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment under international law, and especially under the Convention Against Torture. So we had kind of a dual approach to that. One is to make a strong link between hostage taking and torture with regard to the hostages themselves. And the second one was to make the link between the families of the hostages to torture. And for that purpose, we had to harness the framework of enforced disappearances. Now, I'm going to go soon enough, step by step, and explain what hostage taking is under international law, what enforced disappearances is under international law, and what's the definition of torture. And I show you how we actually managed to combine everything together. I will try to do it in an organized way. And of course, any questions that you might have at the end, we're going to have enough time for Q&A. So we're going to have, well, depends how long you can stay because of the slight delay we've had. But generally speaking, we're going to have enough time for Q&A. And I believe that we will be able to answer everything. Now, I'm sure you're aware of that the notion of hostage taking is neither new nor unique. And if we go in the last, I don't know, I can talk about a few examples that we are probably everyone here is familiar with. We've heard about the Boko Haram, who kidnapped 276 schoolgirls in northeastern Nigeria in 2014. And to this day, about 100 of them is still in captivity. We know about the 1976 Entebbe operation, in which 248 passengers of the flight were kidnapped, and then most of them were released, and 94 Israelis remained in captivity until they were rescued by the IDF. In 2002, we had the Moscow theater incident, where Chechen rebels basically took control over the theater and everyone inside it. They took control over a little bit over 900 people. And at the end of the release operation, about 130 people died in that operation. 130 of the hostages died. In that case, it was a bit unique because I think most of them died because of the Russian authorities and their treatment in their attempt to rescue, and the gas they used and the ill treatment they provided, and that was a case on its own. And of course, as Mia said, we have the Israeli most recent atrocities of October 7th, which followed about more than 250 hostages. 59 of them are still being held captive. And we have a very vivid knowledge, and we have a lot of information about the way they are being treated, the way they've been captured. We have footage of that. We have actually video footage of how they were captured. We know how they were treated. We know that they are not getting enough food. We know that they are being held in the tunnels. We know about the physical abuse, being chained. They don't receive proper treatment. We know that about the psychological abuse that they received just a couple of days ago. I lost track of time difference if it was yesterday or the day before, but we've heard Yarden Vivas talks about the fact that the kidnappers told him that his family, his wife and kids were killed, and they told him, no, that's okay. You'll get a new wife. You'll get a better wife. You'll get new kids. You'll get better kids while he was there. And then there are other examples which I prefer not to go into graphic details in that case. They haven't received any visitations, not from the Red Cross, despite their efforts. I don't blame the Red Cross for not being able to visit them because Hamas doesn't allow them to, or any other humanitarian body. They have been forced to record videos aimed for their families, for the Israeli public, for the government, calling for the end of the fighting. And we know a lot about what happened in the tunnels and how they were basically tortured in those tunnels. And if you look at every one of the examples I just gave, the Boko Haram, the Entebbe, the Moscow theater, and October 7th, you will notice one thing that is actually in common to each and every one of those cases. And that's the fact that every one of them was by a non-state actor. These were not state-operated hostages. These were non-state actors operated hostages. And that makes things a little bit more complicated under international law, because the main players in international law are states, and states are the ones who are party to relevant conventions. And therefore, if we look at the definitions of torture or enforced disappearances, and well, not as much a hostage taking, but if you look at the definition, and we're going to get into them, you can see that sometimes there is a difference between if the actions were done by a state or by a non-state actor. And we had to address that element as well. So our goal was to ensure that there is a recognition of the suffering of the families of the hostages as direct victims of torture. And we believe that the international community must acknowledge that connection as well, because, as I said before, we are using international law as a language, and if they are recognized as direct victims of torture, it means that the international law has to address them as such, and then it actually changes some of the way that we would use international law on the one side, but also the way the international community would address the families on their own. So as part of that mindset, we got in touch with the Special Rapporteur on torture, and we invited her to visit Israel. She accepted that invitation, and she visited Israel. We took her to the kibbutzim in the south, in the Gaza enclave. We walked around. She saw the burned areas. She saw how close it is to the border. She listened from survivors of October 7th what they experienced there. Then she met with other family members. She met with survivors of the kidnapping. former released hostages in order to learn what happened on October 7th and what happened since October 7th. And around that time, it was in December 2024, we also submitted our report. So we also, it was the same time that we actually knew what we want to say and how we want to convey it to the Special Rapporteur. Now, while the situation of the hostages and the way that they were abducted and the treatment they received was unfortunate as it may be, but it was clear-cut. You can see the connection between the hostage-taking and the torture they've been through. The situation of the family members is a bit more complicated because we need some interpretations to use some of the frameworks, including enforced disappearances, in order to take from hostage-taking to enforced disappearances to torture. So there has to be some link, there has to be some wave that we need to create in order to convey that message to ensure that that recognition will be established. So how did we make that connection? So in order to explain how we make that connection, I'm going to explain to you a little bit about each one of those frameworks. So the first framework is hostage-taking. Hostage-taking is covered in international law under the International Convention Against the Taking of Hostages of 1979, which was an outcome of a lot of hostage scenarios that took place in the 1970s. And I saw that someone in the chat asked me about the Munich Olympics. Yeah, that was also one of the incidents that has led to the establishment of that convention. And that convention defines hostage-taking as capture or hold another person and threaten to harm or keep them captive to force someone else to do or avoid from doing something in exchange for their release. So that motive is a key element. We want to use, well, we don't want to use them. The kidnappers want to use them as leverage. That's a key element of hostage taking. That definition is a very useful one. Everyone in international law uses that. There are two interesting caveats to that convention. One, it excludes every hostage taking that takes place during an armed conflict. And the second one, Israel is not party to that convention. Israel is not party to that convention because it has an element that excludes also national liberation movements under certain situations, and Israel has an issue with that definition under international law. Under armed conflict, we actually look at international humanitarian law, meaning Geneva Conventions and their additional protocols, which also prohibit hostage taking, but they don't define hostage taking. And therefore, in order to understand what hostage taking is, we go back to that convention. And this is why it's important to know that, even though it's not applicable in situation of conflict, which the scenario of October 7th is definitely under an armed conflict, the definition is still applicable and it's relevant. And therefore, it's important to understand that the meaning, the leverage, is a key element for hostage taking. Now, the second framework is enforced disappearances. Enforced disappearances, simply put, is to make a person disappear. Well, kind of obvious when you say it, but the basic notion of that, the origin of enforced disappearances, is again the 1970s, but then this time we go to Latin America. In Latin America, we had all the military regime and the junta, as there were a lot of incidents where people who objected the authorities just disappeared. No one knew where they are. No one knew if they are alive or dead. They were held, if they were held incommunicado, and it was basically impossible to know what happened to them. And that slowly, as international law usually does, has led to the International Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearances. That framework defines what enforced disappearance is, and it means where the government or person operating from on behalf of the government, basically by arresting, detaining, abducting, or killing a person, make them disappear, but they refuse to admit it or provide any information about where they are or what happened to them. That definition, if you listen carefully to that, it says that it has to be done by the government or on behalf of the government, which, as I said before, if we talked about non-state actors, suddenly we have some problems with that definition, and we need to see if it is applicable or not applicable. Throughout the years, that definition has been sharpened and interpreted, and it has been acknowledged that on top of the person disappeared, a direct victims of enforced disappearances are also the family members who have to live in constant constant ambiguity about what happened to their family members. Are they alive? Are they dead? Are they injured? Are they being treated? What happened to them? Where they are? If and when they're going to be released? And that notion of enforced disappearances, by expanding it to the family members as well, make sure that they are being heard. And therefore, the UN has established a working group on enforced and involuntary disappearances. And the members of the working group have the task and have the mandate of being in touch with the families of the disappeared persons, and they are trying to connect governments and non-state actors in order to release or to help to release or promote it, hopefully quickly. However, almost as anything under international laws, especially under international human rights law, that working group has no way to enforce its decisions or any other mechanism that would be actually useful. And therefore, all they can do is to get in touch with the relevant government, get in touch with the relevant organization, in our case, Hamas, and ask them to provide information, ask them to release. And we've been in touch with the working group pretty much since November 2023. And they've been telling us over and over again, we are contacting Hamas directly, but we haven't received any response from them. So we know that that route is important to use for acknowledgement, but it's not a very practical one. However, their interpretation of recognizing the family members as direct victims of enforced disappearances is important for our goal, and we are going to use that in order to progress our goal of recognizing the families as direct victims of torture. And the third framework is, of course, the definition of torture under international law. The Convention Against Torture of 1984 defines torture as intentional infliction of severe physical or medical pain, or mental pain, which is important, on someone in order to force confession, to get information, punish them, intimidate them, or discriminate against them when done by or with the approval of public officials. Again, by the state officials. So we have again the notion of the state as an important element of the definition of torture as it was with enforced disappearances. And again, some technical obstacle that we had to deal with. Now, torture is defined as jus cogens in international law. Jus cogens means that under it is categorically prohibited under all circumstances to torture a person. And that is common understanding of international law. This is a complete rule. And as someone who also teaches public international law in academia, I can tell you whenever we want to give an example of what jus cogens means, what customary law means in international law, we go directly to the notion of torture. And we say that even if, and we know that some states do torture sometimes, but they do it and they hide it because they know it is wrong. They know it is wrong and they know it is prohibited. And therefore, they even if they do it, they hide it. They don't go and say, well, yeah, we torture everyone. We are proud of it. And therefore, the framework of torture, if you go under the framework of torture, you know that you are under a categorical prohibition under international law, i.e. jus cogens. Now, the questions that we had to deal with in our submissions were two questions. I think I've said it in so many words previously. One is to connect hostage taking to torture with regard to the hostages. So hostages are victims of torture. And the second one is how to connect the families to torture through and recognize them as well as victims of torture. Now, we based our argument on several approaches, but our main idea with regard to the hostages was that hostage taking could be a form of torture when the circumstances are severe. And if we look even briefly about the circumstances of the hostages in Gaza, we know that they've lost about a third of their body weight. We know that they haven't received proper treatment for their injuries or health conditions. They were held in tunnels with being chained for significant periods of time. We've heard about sexual abuse. We heard about mental abuse, being used as human shields from attack. Yeah, I'm gonna drop any graphical examples that always come up in mind because I don't like to use their examples in such case, but always welcome to ask me later on or to contact me outside of the presentation. And with regard to the families of the hostages, they are also physically and mentally impaired because of the hostage taking. And we know about psychological harm. We know about physical harm. We know about the state of ambiguous loss. When people don't really know if their loved ones are alive or dead, they're uncertain about that. We know about anxiety, depression. We know about PTSD that they have developed. Some of them, a lot of them, survived October 7th. They were there, they survived those attacks, and then they have to deal with the fact that their families have been taken captive. They have some chronic illness. Some of them developed new illness, sleep disorders, and of course, as Mia said, one of the groups we've very much concerned about are children whose parents have been taken hostage, and they also have a complete unique set of difficulties that they have developed because of that. So if we talk about damage inflicted under the definition of torture, yeah, we have damage inflicted on the hostages and the family, and a significant damage. But we still need to create that link between the hostage taking and the torture for the hostages, and the enforced disappearances, which is a wider framework which also recognizes the families as victims, and torture. So that was our main goal. Now, the connection between hostage taking and torture was already being established to some extent. The Human Rights Council Advisory Committee, for example, in 2013, has already noted that the damages caused to hostages, which we're talking about physical and psychological damage, and especially psychological effects, including cognitive, emotional, and social reactions to the hostage situation, are very similar to the ones that we see in victims of torture. So there is already some kind of link that we can connect between what happened to hostages and what happened to victims of torture. And same with regard to enforced disappearances. We've had, under international law, we had the Committee Against Torture, and we have decisions by the European Court of Human Rights and the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, and etc., talking about that connection between forced disappearances and torture. But most of them talked about the torture of the person disappeared. So that person has the right to that person's right to be free from torture has been violated only by the mere fact that that person has disappeared. And I can give you a complete different example from Venezuela about enforced disappearances, about a person who was sentenced to 13 years in prison in 1997 for 13 years. And in 2009, a few months before that person ended their time in prison, in the morning, he called his father and talked to his father. And in the evening, that father received a call from the jail saying that his son was killed. His son is dead. And he went to the court, he went to the jail and asked to see his son, what happened to him. And from that point on, in 2009, and I think until today, no one knows what happened to his son. And he was in jail. He was under the authority of the authorities. He was under the control of the authorities in the jail. And because of that situation, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights has recognized that the mere fact that he disappeared constitutes torture towards that person, but also his family members are victims of enforced disappearances. So we have the connection between forced disappearances and torture, and we have the connection between forced disappearances and the families. We still need to make that link between forced disappearances and torture and see some direct connection between them. And that direct connection came through the fact that when we look at the implication of enforced disappearances, we see that there are circles of impact. The core is, of course, the disappeared person, the hostage in our case. The second circle is the family and close friends of that person. And then there is another circle of society. And the families of the hostages were experiencing victimization of enforced disappearances and being tortured from two fronts in our claim. One, it was the immediate loss of their family members who were kidnapped, They live in uncertainty about their status. They don't know if they're alive or dead. Are they injured? How they're being treated, and for how long they're going to be gone. And they often dedicate their lives to save their family members, which means they don't work. They almost don't eat. They don't eat well. They don't sleep well. They are traveling all over the world just for the purpose of meeting with uh, anyone who would listen to them and would try to do anything. Everything they do is around that framework, and that causes uh, an extreme emotional distress for the family members. The second front of victimization is the fact that they are not only in the situation of being looking out for the family members, they are also being directly targeted by the kidnappers, by Hamas in this situation, Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, who send videos of their family members, and they are even going further than that in order to in the lack of any other word, although it really shows what my intention is, to torture the family members. I will give you two examples, and I won't go more than those two examples intentionally. But one of them is the situation of Daniela Gilboa, who until April 2023 was my neighbor, by the way. Like 6 months before she was kidnapped, she moved from my building to a different to another place, but I know her. And somewhere in 2024, Hamas released an image of her within a body bag and create the assumption that she was dead. Her family didn't know whether or not to believe Hamas or not. It seems that almost everyone told them, well, it looks like she's dead. We're gonna probably should consider her from now on as a dead hostage, which is also a category that we care about. We include them and we're trying to bring all of them back, of course. But of course, there is a different treatment between those who are alive and those who are dead in all aspects. But the family members refused to agree and said, we don't trust Hamas. We don't believe them that they are dead. And if all the information we have is the footage that they sent, it's not enough for us. So they kept working as if under the assumption that she is alive. And she was. A few months later, she was released. Alive. I can't say alive and well because she's been to so many days in captivity, but she was alive and she was walking and she was functioning. She was not dead at all. But that was part of the psychological torture that they've been through. Another case is throughout the second deal of the releases, a little bit after Daniela Gilboa was released, Hamas sent a gift with one of the released hostages to the mother of Matan Tsangauker. They sent her an hourglass to demonstrate that the time of Matan in captivity is running out. And then she received that. And then she's a strong person and she's an amazing person. And she took that and said, this is my sign of life that Matan is still alive. But still, Hamas directed her intentionally in order to affect her and her behavior. Now, our claim, to summarize our claim, was that there is a strong connection between hostage taking, enforced disappearances, and torture. The framework of enforced disappearances includes the families of the disappeared persons and as direct victims, and the intended and directed infliction of harm by Hamas towards the families of the hostages must lead us to one conclusion and one specific conclusion, that the families are direct victims of torture. That was generally our submission. We used everything that a lawyer would actually use, all sources and references and cases and everything we need in order to make that point. We submitted that in mid-December, and about a month ago, the Special Rapporteur published a report on hostage taking as a form of torture. And in her report, she recognized the importance of acknowledging the families of the hostages as victims and ensure that they receive proper treatment and they receive rehabilitation treatment just like any other victim of torture. She also noted that the treatment must receive as early as possible, even before the family members return. And she noted the importance of having a government representative who would be in charge of taking care of the hostages and their families. And she also she recognize that hostage taking involves forms of torture, which was what we also lobbied for. And she also called the Secretary General to appoint a special representative for hostage taking, someone on behalf of the UN will be in touch with the families, will be in touch with the government, and try to negotiate their release just as well, and not just trust the governments themselves to do it, but also make sure that the international community, and especially the UN, are very active on that. She, of course, called for the immediate release of all the hostages, immediate and unconditional release of all the hostages, and asked the international community to take that case very seriously, including the relevant working groups and the International Criminal Court, to make sure that everyone that should be accountable will be held accountable for the taking of hostages and the torture that they have been going through, the hostages and their families. I think I'm going to stop here and then see if you have any questions. But I try to give you the full picture of what we've been working on and what the framework has been through, and how we're trying to make a change both in international law and the discussion, but everything we are doing within that framework is always done with the notion that we're trying to do everything we can to make it go forward towards the release of the hostages, which is the high cause. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ido. That was remarkable. And considering the subject matter, the fact that you had two significant wins at the end in the response of the Special Rapporteur, I think is a source of comfort, I'm guessing both for those who are keen on international law developing, but certainly I hope for the families whose family members are still held in Gaza, or future families whose family members will be hostage.